Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Brazilian President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva's China visit has drawn worldwide attention, partly because of the bilateral agreement of using their own currencies for settlement following a global trend of de-dollarization. How will the visit shape the relationship between the two large developing nations? Why countries are reducing their reliance on US dollars? At the same time, are we seeing an upsurge of non-alignment around the world in the past year? With these questions in mind, I'm glad to be joined by Mr. Jorge Heine, former Chilean ambassador to China. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Hello and welcome to Dialogue, Ambassador. So President Lula is here in Beijing. His politics are quite different from his predecessor, Bolsonaro. And of course, in his victory speech last year, Lula talked about relaunching or reshaping ties with China. So what do you expect, and in what way his China trip may help relaunch the relationship?
Well, I think this is of the highest significance. Latin America is entering now a new phase with the election of President Lula and the election of other presidents in Colombia, before that in Chile and in Mexico, that are committed to regional cooperation. Some of the previous presidents were not really committed to regional cooperation, and several entities like CELAC and UNASUR had real difficulties or were simply jettisoned, like UNASUR. So now what we're seeing is an attempt by Brazil to rebuild these regional institutions. UNASUR is at the forefront of that. And in that regard also, of course, to work with China to make the most of this very important relationship. I would say that the visit of President Lula, what I think has significant symbolic importance, is the fact that former President Dilma Rousseff will become the new president of the BRICS Bank, the new development bank, so-called BRICS Bank, that is headquartered in Shanghai. But to have a former president of Brazil heading this bank sends a very powerful message about the significance of BRICS and its potential enlargement and its significance for the global South. I understand President Lula is traveling with a 40-strong delegation, including businessmen and women and government officials, journalists. So I would attach the highest significance to this visit.
Mm-hmm. Well, both sides have expressed a strong desire to further cooperate in terms of trade and investment in their overall relationship, given the fact that Brazil is the largest nation in Latin America. And also you mentioned about the new governments in several countries in this region. How do you see this, the prospect of China developing ties with regional countries, countries in the region beyond, beyond Brazil, with Chile, with other countries in the region?
So this visit by President Lula isn't a one-off. I expect this to be one of a significant number of additional visits from Latin America. I attach the highest importance to this visit. When I was ambassador in Beijing, I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in 4 high-level visits in the 3.5 years I was there. President Bachelet visited China twice in these 3.5 years. This was from 2014 to 2017. And President Xi visited Chile, and Prime Minister Li Keqiang visited Chile as well. So these visits are very significant. They concentrate the mind. They lead to the signing of agreements. I understand President Lula and President Xi will sign something like 20 cooperation agreements on this occasion. So this visit generates a certain positive dynamic that is absolutely essential to move things forward. Bureaucracies tend to be a bit slow, but when there is a state visit, everybody gets on their feet and does the needful.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, of course, among the deals, one of them is this settlement arrangement, basically using their own currencies to facilitate trade between the two nations, and of course, basically by not using the US dollar as the intermediate. Some people say this is part of the trend, of de-dollarization. How do you look at that? Why countries like China, Russia, of course, they have reasons, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia,
So,
Indonesia, the 10 ASEAN countries, they are all talking about the avoidance of using or relying too much on US dollar. What are the major drivers for this change?
yes, that's a very good point. My own view is that there are advantages in having one currency as the international currency, but those advantages start to evaporate the moment this advantage is weaponized and used, against countries in a variety of ways. In that sense, what we have seen in the course of the past 2 years is a steady weaponization of the dollar. This has led to a strong reaction in many countries around the world that are starting to realize that maybe they shouldn't depend so much on the US dollar because they become vulnerable to this weaponization when there are differences of opinion on various matters. So in that sense, I think what is happening between China and Brazil is very significant. I understand ICBC is undertaking the first major transaction on trade between Brazil and China, not using the dollar. So I think this is going to be a much more widespread trend in months and years to come.
Well, Ambassador, also, people say the decline of or the reduced use of US dollar also has something to do with the inflation or the practice of US the Fed Reserve to print money, basically to bail the country out of a financial crisis. Of course, that has consequences for developing nations. It's more expensive for them to import and also heavier in terms of their debt to service. So people say, probably enough is enough. And if there's a way out, they want to have an alternative in terms of, how to conduct a trade.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the United States has a big advantage as its own currency is the, international currency. And that means that it can do many things that other countries cannot, like print money and to some degree at will, and it will be taken around the world. But that has limits, as you quite rightly say. And I would say, but more than that, the real concern, I would say, in many countries around the world is the weaponization of the dollar. I think that has been taken to the limit, and there's been a reaction. I would hope that the United States would withdraw the use of this weaponization to the degree it has, because it is not having a good effect around the world.
Well, Ambassador, in your new book recently published, you talked about an interesting phenomenon. You call it upsurge of non-alignment. During the past year, actually, since the conflict break out between Ukraine and Russia, tell us more about your observation and insight into that new development.
Yes, this book, the English edition has just come out in London, published by Anthem. The title is Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. And there we examine the phenomenon that in this new tensions that have erupted in the world in the past few years, Latin American countries have taken a position that is basically not to side with the great powers, but look at their own interests. Latin American countries have been pressured to take a position, for example, in the case of the war in Ukraine. They've even been asked to send weapons to Ukraine. Countries like Brazil, like Argentina, like Colombia have been asked to do so, and they have refused to do so. They have also refused to back diplomatic and economic sanctions on Russia. They have condemned the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but they have refrained from endorsing the sanctions. Why? They say this is a European war that must be solved by Europeans. This cannot be transformed into a global war into which everybody has to pitch in. And therefore, they have decided to take their own interest in mind and have not gotten into the position of backing one or another of the belligerents in this war. And that is what we call active non-alignment. And it seems to us that the position that Brazil has taken, looking for a peaceful mediation in the war in Ukraine, looking for a solution to this very tragic war, rather than continuing to press for its continuation with providing more weapons, as other countries have done, is the way forward. Brazil has not taken a stance in terms of the war itself. It has condemned the invasion, but it's not taking a stance on the war itself, as it has stayed neutral, and at the same time, it is pushing for a solution. And President Lula has come up with a peace plan that I would think would probably be discussed in his visit to China. And that, it seems to me, is the way forward.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that has something to do with the new governments in Latin American countries? Some of them, or many of them actually, are being seen as on the left. Or do you think this kind of pragmatism or independent policy pursuing their own national interests will continue or will be consistent in the near future?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that active non-alignment is a matter of left or right. It is not an ideological position. It is, as you say, it is a pragmatic stance of saying we have to look after ourselves. We do not have to take sides in these international conflicts. If we take sides, in the end, we will lose. Latin America has undergone a very serious crisis. It was very badly affected by the pandemic. Some projections indicate that this year it might have negative economic growth. So it is facing many challenges. And to come out of those challenges, it has to enhance regional cooperation. It has to work for multilateralism, and it has to look out for itself rather than for the interests of one or another of the great powers.
Mm-hmm. You earlier talked about the pressure, probably from the US or from European countries on Latin American countries to basically choose a side, to support Ukraine and impose sanctions on Russia. What about, their position in terms of US competition with China or sometimes tension? Is there a pressure for them to side with Washington or somehow they cannot go too close with China?
Yes, well, absolutely. And in fact, before the war in Ukraine, the pressures that existed was to where to take sides between the United States and China. And our argument in the book on active non-alignment is that active non-alignment means you have to look after your own interests and you examine each issue on its merits. There may be some issues in which Latin American countries may be closer to the United States. There may be others in which it may be closer to China. The point is not to side automatically, in toto, a priori, with Washington or with Beijing or with Moscow or with Brussels, for that matter. And now this puts a great pressure on Latin American foreign ministries, because it means we have to analyze very thoroughly every issue and come up with the right answer. You cannot make mistakes here. But if you do that, you will be better off than simply, doing as you are told, as aligned countries do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your time and insights. After this short break, we will be joined by Professor Rana from the University of Oxford to present an international perspective on China's path to modernization. Stay with us. Welcome back. China has set a path to achieve modernization with Chinese characteristics, with its own approach and guiding principles. So how does this path differ from those taken by Western developed countries, and how do other countries view China's modernization path? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined today by Professor Rana, Director of the University of Oxford China Center and Fellow of St. Cross College. Welcome to the discussion, Professor Mater. We know China is on the path of achieving modernization with Chinese characteristics. So from your perspective, how would you describe the Chinese path to modernization?
I think there are several factors that make the Chinese path to modernization very distinctive. And briefly, I'll just say what they are. I think they have to do with scale, history, and technological input. So what I mean by that is, first of all, scale. China has the biggest single internal market of any country in the world. In other words, if you have an idea in China, if you're entrepreneurial in China, you can spread that idea out to over 1 billion people. And actually, that's a rare opportunity. So I think in terms of how ideas have modernized, how the economy has modernized, the scale of size in China has been really important. The second issue is to do with history, as I've said. I think in some ways, China has had to deal with the fact that modernization came to China in the mid-19th century in a way that was very violent, very coercive. In other words, other countries invading China, bringing their form of industrialization through force. And China found itself, I think, in a difficult position of both accepting some of that modernization, but also wanting to push back against it. So that is quite distinctive in China. And the third factor, as I've said, is technological input. Now, I think it's really interesting that China spends 2.4% of its GDP on research, technology, and education. And I think in terms of modernization, that's a really important figure. That's a really important factor. And that also makes China in some ways very distinctive. So those are some of my big three that I would say in terms of understanding the modernization of China in the contemporary era and over the last century or so.
Well, you mentioned very interesting some of the facts and perspectives, like the scale of modernization, 1.4 billion people. Obviously, it's not an easy job, to say the least. But does that explain, why China stress very much on, the Chinese term common prosperity, meaning maybe narrowing gap between rich and poor? So is that the reason?
So common prosperity, this term, 共同富裕, is actually a really long-standing term in its origins. You can find versions of that going back into the era of the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty as well. In other words, we can look at this in a long-term historical perspective as being a goal of Chinese governments and organizations over quite a long period of time. Now, why does it matter in the contemporary era? Well, I would say that one of the things that's happened in the last 40 to 45 years in the era of economic reform and globalization in China is that China has no doubt become much, much richer on a per capita GDP basis. In other words, you start in the 1970s with very low income per person, and now it's approximately 10,000 US dollars per year, which means that China is a middle to upper middle income country. But during that time, the differentiation between the two parts of China, the urban and rural, have become greater. In other words, a lot of the growth has happened in China's cities, where we see skyscrapers, we see high-speed railways, we see the technology really changing those cities. But the countryside, yes, there have been advances, it's true, but the advances are slower and they need to move on. And that's why I think there's recently been a lot more emphasis on the rural areas and the idea of the countryside as the next frontier for China's economic growth and modernization. And I think that income inequality, you're right, is one of the reasons that there's been so much attention on this idea of common prosperity.
You mentioned about, of course, the rural area, the urban area, very different. You also talked about the Chinese history, even this common prosperity. The concept itself is from history, to say the least, hundreds of years ago, if not 1,000 years ago. So speak of history, and of course, together with the reality, people would describe China as a socialist country or communist country. But at the same time, you do see the Chinese philosophy. It's part of the history being reflected in the Chinese governance, in how China runs its own affairs. Tell us more in that respect.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that actually you see maybe in the last 30 or 40 years is the growing interest in aspects of China's pre-modern, some people would say traditional, I'm not so keen on that term, but let's use it for a moment, traditional philosophy and ethical systems. So we have to mention here Confucius, who of course is still probably one of the most famous philosophers in the world, and maybe the most famous Chinese figure over a historical longer period. What is it that I think that kind of thinking brings to contemporary issues of social change and equality in China? Well, one of the things that's very clear is that Confucian thinking, the thinking of the philosopher Confucius, who lived, 2,500 years ago, is about mutual obligations. In other words, that the idea that a benevolent society, a society which works well, is one where people actually realize that they have obligations to each other. Confucius often said that actually coercion, violence, forcing people to do things should not be necessary if people actually are able to understand mutual benefit and mutual understanding. And in some ways, followers of his in later centuries, such as Mencius, Mengzi, also followed that particular path. Why does that matter for today? Well, I would say that in the era when you have much bigger societies than existed during the time of Confucius, when essentially he was living in what is today Shandong and areas in northern China. These were relatively small areas of territory. But now, of course, we have China and other countries that have, hundreds of millions, even over 1 billion people. These ideas of mutual obligation, but also mutual respect and mutual interaction, I think are really important in keeping society stable and understanding how people actually should operate in a way that means that everyone needs to share in the prosperity. So I think that there is a very strong traditional sense that bringing back that older philosophical thinking about how a society should be even and stable still has a lot of relevance today. I will add one other thing, which is that historians will know that more than 100 years ago, in the early 20th century, there was quite a strong reaction against that kind of thinking. The great Chinese writer Lu Xun, who many people will know from his stories such as Diary of a Madman or Kung Yi Ji, he was actually in those days very opposed to the traditional Confucian thinking. He thought that in some ways it was holding China back. And I think it's taken a century for, in some ways, Chinese society to come back and understand where the positive value lies in that thinking, as opposed to 100 years ago, when in some ways a lot of the intellectuals in China were very angry with that sort of traditional thinking. But I think we're in a different sort of situation today.
You also mentioned about technology. Obviously, China has invested in, a lot, both in private sector and also in the public sector. To develop the economy, to create jobs. It seems like the government understands perfectly. They have talked a lot about innovation-driven economy, or you rely on the technological progress to push forward the overall social development. So is that any different from other countries, I would say?
Well, I would say I'd go back to my other factor, which is scale. In other words, China has a size of economy, a size of market that enables it to experiment in a big way. So let me take one really big example that leads to a problem we haven't mentioned yet, but I think we absolutely have to bring in as something where China has a central role, and that is green energy and climate change. In other words, the idea that as the world has to deal with probably the single biggest problem that is facing the entire species of humanity, which is the question of how we get to net zero and deal with the question of climate change. China, of course, as one of the world's biggest economies, along with India, the United States, the European Union, will play a central role. So let's think about one of the things that China is very involved in, which is the development of green energy technology. And we do know that one of the ways in which investment is being placed in China in terms of conversion of energy sources is turning away from fossil fuels over time and much more towards that kind of green energy. Now, I think that China does have a special position in that it has investment and technology that enable it to essentially create new sources of that kind of green technology. We could think about electric vehicle batteries as being one example of that. But the point is that that experiment is only at the beginning. We're just beginning as a species to understand how we have to shift away from the traditional fossil fuels and towards those new forms of green technology. So China's contribution in terms of technology and investment will be important, but it won't have the fullest and most effective results unless that happens in terms of making sure that the technology is exported to other emerging economies. That could be in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and also operates working with development of green energy elsewhere in the world. So you could say it's a China issue, but actually it's a global issue as well.
Well, as China continues to develop, it seems like there's almost like a spillover effects into the area, for example, diplomacy, in terms of how China conducts its foreign affairs. For example, recently the attention has been on the China basically negotiated the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and of course China has been talking about a peaceful solution to the Ukraine crisis, and it has been receiving heads of state or heads of the governments from European countries, Southeast Asia. Now Lula, president of Brazil, is in China. So China has been very active since the reopening of the country earlier this year. So does that also reflect a kind of a Chinese philosophy? That philosophy works or functions in terms of domestic governance, but also probably functions in terms of how China sees the world and deal with the rest of the world.
Well, I would say as a historian, actually, this isn't necessarily entirely new. So even 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you would see that there were the beginnings of Chinese international diplomacy in some of these areas, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where China began to play a bigger role in terms of United Nations peacekeeping, where actually China has put troops in terms of those United Nations peacekeeping bodies. But also beyond that, some of the issues such as Darfur, where there was a Chinese involvement in international negotiations. So in some ways, you see that position developing over decades. It's not just something that suddenly happened quite recently. So I think that the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal was something that actually took a lot of people in the wider world by surprise. And the argument that China could essentially use its good offices, use its diplomatic capacity to bring some calm to an often very turbulent region, I think was widely welcomed. In terms of Ukraine, this is an issue which is still very, very much in formation. I think the step, including actually I've seen from some bloggers in Beijing, that we're still waiting for at the moment, is for the conversation between China and Ukraine directly. There have been some smaller level conversations, I think, between the foreign ministers. But if the top leaders are now going to go into a one-on-one conversation, that's the next stage. We know that obviously China has set up quite a strong diplomatic relationship with Russia. So that's one half of the equation. At the United Nations, it continues to abstain when it comes to making a judgment on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's something that basically takes a kind of quite diplomatic stand in terms of sitting between the two. So the missing element in that puzzle now is China talking directly to Kiev, to Ukraine. And I think a lot of people are waiting to see what that step will bring next of all. I think there's also right now on the day we're speaking and recording this, actually, Tindor, a very, very interesting and potentially worrying development where China has a really important peacekeeping role. That's North Korea. We know that just within the last few hours as I'm speaking, there have been missiles fired from North Korea off the coast of Japan. It caused even air raid sirens to be heard on Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. It was absolutely terrifying for the population there. What we've seen in the past is that China, which has very good relations with Pyongyang, which is able to talk to Seoul, and of course has relations with Tokyo, has as a regional leader a really important role in terms of bringing peace to the Korean peninsula. So another opportunity has actually come up for Beijing to show how far its diplomatic skills are actually able to operate. And I think the world will be looking at the Korean peninsula in the next few days to see what moves Beijing is going to make in that particular troubled area as well.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell. Thank you for your time and insights. On that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Tindor. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.